The first takeoff from a ship's deck in history took place on November 14, 1910. American pilot Eugene Ely lifted an airplane directly from a ship. And on January 18, 1911, he was also the first to land on the deck of a cruiser. These two dates are usually considered the birth of carrier aviation. During the First World War, aircraft carriers began to appear, a new class of warship that was soon destined to become the main striking force of leading navies. Directly before the Second World War, different countries had 23 aircraft carriers. Japan had 9, the USA had 7, England had 6, and France had 1. The missions of aircraft carriers quickly became clear. Their aircraft struck ships and convoys, bases, and coastal targets, provided air and anti-submarine defense for large formations and convoys, and carried out reconnaissance at sea. All this made the carrier the center of strength of a squadron. The first large-scale operation with the mass use of carriers was the Japanese carrier aviation raid on Pearl Harbor on December 7, 1941. The strike was delivered from 6 carriers, and the U.S. fleet suffered heavy losses. This episode clearly demonstrated what carriers were capable of and sharply changed attitudes toward them in the USA, England, and other countries. They were recognized as one of the main striking forces at sea. Mass construction began. During the war years, 169 carriers entered service, 137 of them in the USA. Special aircraft were needed for service from a ship. Compared to land-based machines, carrier-based fighters differed by having devices for takeoff and landing on a short deck, increased range thanks to larger fuel tanks, naval navigation, and communication equipment, as well as folding wings to save space in hangars and on deck. At first, such aircraft were derived from modified land models, but soon they began to be designed from scratch, specifically for carrier conditions. In the Pacific, American carrier aviation had to fight mainly on 3 types of fighters: the Wildcat, Hellcat, and Corsair. The Wildcat first flew on September 2, 1937, and quickly proved itself as a reliable machine. In terms of speed, it was inferior to the Japanese Zero, but its large wing provided excellent handling and maneuverability, while protected tanks and armor around the cockpit increased survivability. Thanks to this, the Wildcat remained in service and was produced until the end of the war. A total of 7,815 aircraft of all modifications were built. When the enemy fielded faster fighters, the U.S. fleet needed a new, more powerful machine. It was planned to replace the Wildcat with the Corsair, but due to delays and shortcomings of the prototype, the Grumman Company was temporarily tasked with creating a new fighter based on the successful solutions of the Wildcat. This was how the Hellcat appeared, so successful that its production continued even after serial deliveries of the Corsair began, lasting until 1949. It became the most mass-produced fighter of U.S. naval aviation during the war. 274 machines were built. The Hellcat accounted for about 75% of all aerial victories achieved by U.S. naval fighters. 5,157 enemy aircraft shot down at the cost of 270 of their own losses. On February 1, 1938, the U.S. Navy announced a competition for a single-seat carrier-based fighter with a speed of no less than 563 kilometers per hour at an altitude of 6,096 meters. The design bureau of the Vought Company, led by Rex Beisel, worked out several options. Since it was unclear which engine would go into series production, 2 versions were prepared simultaneously, one for a 1,200 horsepower engine and another for an 18-cylinder 2,000 horsepower engine. Theoretical calculations inclined the U.S. Navy to choose the second version of the project, and on June 11, 1938, a contract for the prototype was signed. Its competitors were 2 other projects, but neither went into series production. Vought engineers installed on the fighter a 3-bladed propeller with a diameter of 160 inches, the largest ever used on a single-engine airplane. The wing was chosen in the special inverted gull form. Seen from the front, it looked like the letter W. This made it easier to ensure the necessary clearance between the ground and the blades without excessively long landing gear struts. Rex Beisel relied on results from wind tunnel tests. For the first time in the company's practice, spot welding was widely applied in the aircraft. It reduced weight and improved aerodynamics. Adjustable shutters were installed on the engine, cowling for cooling. Armament of the prototype: 1 heavy machine gun in each wing and 2 synchronized machine guns above the engine. To attack dense bomber formations, a cassette of 20 small bombs was placed in the wings. The idea was simple: fly over the formation from above and sprinkle it. From February 8 to 11, 1939, a Navy commission accepted the full-scale mock-up at the factory, after which work accelerated. After bench engine tests and ground trials, the company's chief test pilot took off from the airfield in Connecticut on May 29, 1940. The first flight lasted 38 minutes and confirmed high potential. But it ended with a forced landing. At about 230 miles per hour, strong vibration of the aileron trim tabs arose, tearing them off. Control was difficult, but the pilot landed without damage. The main problems identified were engine overheating and a temperamental fuel system, so another experienced pilot was brought into the tests. On the fifth test flight on June 12, 1940, pilot Boone Guyton made an emergency landing on a golf course at a speed of about 150 kilometers per hour. The aircraft struck trees, flipped over, the tail and propeller were badly damaged, and one wing was torn off. The pilot miraculously survived. It seemed that with such damage, restoration was impossible, but the successful design helped. After 3 months, the machine was repaired, and in October, the tests continued. A new engine with a power of 2,000 horsepower was installed. On October 1st, during a transfer flight, the aircraft for the first time exceeded a speed of 650 kilometers per hour and reached 652 kilometers per hour. At a full weight of about 4,250 kilograms, the rate of climb was approximately 810 meters per minute, the practical ceiling about 10,700 meters. Drawbacks were also revealed. At minimal landing speed, the aircraft could lose control, and the engine was still overheating and required further refinement. The program also included dives from an altitude of about 3,000 meters. There, a maximum speed of approximately 830 kilometers per hour was achieved. Such load tore off the fabric covering on the control surfaces and ailerons. On January 28, 1941, the last high-speed dive was performed, starting from about 6,000 meters and reaching about 810 kilometers per hour. It had to end with an emergency landing. The engine was damaged due to the overspeeding of the propeller during the dive. Another test, a 10-turn spin, showed that it was extremely difficult to recover. Only the release of a special anti-spin parachute stopped the rotation. All this showed that the prototype needed refinement. The experience of the war in Europe also pushed for changes. Armament was strengthened. Instead of the early scheme, 6 heavy machine guns were installed, 3 in each wing. 2 bomb racks were added under the inner parts of the wings. The old bomb containers were removed. Because of the new guns, the fuel tanks were taken out of the wings, and the fuel reserve was placed immediately behind the engine in a protected tank. The cockpit was moved slightly back. The canopy was simplified, fewer metal frames, and transparent inserts were added at the rear to improve visibility of the tail hemisphere. The tail wheel and arrestor hook were updated. The pilot and important units were protected with armor and thick armored glass. A friend or foe recognition system appeared. The final demonstration flights for the Navy took place at the end of February, after which, already at the beginning of March, the company was given the green light for series production. In the summer of the next year, the first production aircraft with a powerful 2,000 horsepower engine took to the air. In trials, the machine showed very high speed at high altitude and good dynamics. At the end of July, the aircraft was officially accepted into service and sent for training on an aircraft carrier in Chesapeake Bay. The plan was to use the new machine as a carrier-based interceptor. But the first attempts at takeoffs and landings on ships were unsuccessful, and the Corsairs initially went to the land-based units of the U.S. Marine Corps. The first were the pilots of a squadron in California. In the fall, they were formed. By the end of the year, declared combat ready. On February 12th, they flew to Guadalcanal. On the first day, they performed a combat mission, escorting long-range bombers, but did not encounter the enemy. 2 days later, on the same task, the Corsairs, together with other American fighters, came under interception by a large number of Japanese Zeros. The debut turned out to be hard. The Corsairs lost several machines. The overall American losses were significant, and the result, only a few Zeros shot down. This is understandable. The pilots had too few hours on the new type. Tactics were not yet developed. But just 2 months later, everything changed. The pilots achieved an impressive score of victories with relatively small losses. They found their formula for combat, to use speed and climb. having seen the enemy, quickly climbed higher, then dropped into a steep dive, struck with fire, pulled back up, and repeated the attack. They did not engage in prolonged maneuvering duels with the Zeros. If it got hot, the Corsair left either by climbing or by a sharp dive. Word of its capabilities spread quickly, and more Marine squadrons received the new machines. Many pilots on the Corsairs became real aces. The first was Lieutenant Kenneth Walsh. 6 victories, including 3 in one day, May 13, 1943. Later, Major Weissenberger shot down 3 Zeros in about 1 minute of battle. Pilot Jensen, during a tropical downpour, lost his group, accidentally discovered a Japanese airfield, descended almost to the ground, and strafed the aircraft on the runway. In one sortie, he destroyed or seriously damaged 24 Japanese aircraft. The next day, photo reconnaissance confirmed it. The squadron was commanded by one of the best American aces, Major Gregory Boyington. In the battles for Rabaul, already having 6 victories in China, he raised his score to 28. On January 3, 1944, he was shot down but survived. Another ace over Rabaul was Lieutenant Robert Hansen. He began service on October 6, 1943, won his first victory already on November 4, and in 17 days of major battle raised his score to 25. On February 3, 1944, his aircraft was damaged by anti-aircraft artillery, and he fell into the sea. By the end of 1943, all Marine fighter squadrons in the South Pacific were already flying Corsairs, and these aircraft had 584 enemy aircraft shot down to their credit. It was much more difficult to teach the Corsair to land on aircraft carriers. The first trial takeoffs and landings from September 25, 1942 showed a number of problems. The aircraft could suddenly lose speed, roll onto the right wing, and go into a spin if the pilot did not react quickly enough. The strong torque of the propeller added instability on takeoff, and before touchdown, the machine swayed right and left. The standard landing pattern almost did not work. The engine blocked the forward view, and drops of oil on the windshield worsened it further. The pilot had to approach not directly but at an angle to see the deck. Before touchdown, the Corsair lowered its nose and struck sharply with the main wheels. The stiff struts bounced, and this often ended with damage. Under such conditions, the Navy could not immediately use the aircraft as a carrier fighter. The designers made great efforts to correct the aircraft's behavior. More than 100 changes were introduced. To fight the torque, the stabilizer was turned slightly left by 2 degrees. For rearward view, a small bulge for a mirror was made on the canopy. The landing gear was made softer. The problem of oil leakage from the cowl flap drive was eliminated by changing the operation mode of the upper cooling flaps. Additional fuel tanks were added into the leading edge of the wing. The maximum weight of the modernized aircraft increased to about 57,760 kilograms. To accelerate production, manufacturing was expanded to 2 more plants. The first aircraft from the second plant flew on February 25, 1943. It differed from the base version essentially by non-folding wings. One such aircraft was even used as a flying laboratory for testing an early American jet engine. The third plant began serial production on April 26 of the same year. On October 3, 1942, modernized aircraft began to enter the Navy's experimental squadron. The command still doubted carrier landing, so at first the squadron was based on land in San Diego. By January 14, 1943, the squadron was fully equipped with 22 Corsairs, and on January 22 it was transferred to an aircraft carrier. In March-April, another squadron received the new aircraft. In mid-April, the unit was transferred to another carrier. It was the first U.S. Navy carrier squadron to go into battle on Corsairs. Starting in September 1943, already operating from land bases in the Solomon Islands, the pilots of this squadron in 76 days shot down 127 Japanese aircraft and sank 5 ships. 15 pilots became aces, among them Lieutenant Ira Kepford, who by the time of returning home achieved 17 victories. The flight group was the first to prove that Corsair fighters could take off from aircraft carriers. On November 8, 1943, taking off from New Georgia, their planes covered the carriers Essex and Bunker Hill while they attacked a Japanese base. The Corsairs shot down a large group of Japanese bombers, almost completely ran out of fuel, and were forced to land on the carrier decks. All landed successfully. This became an important signal for the command. Fighters could be more widely used from ships, but not everything always went smoothly. On January 25, 1944, 23 Corsairs set off on a flight of about 700 miles. The weather and an unfortunate route led to the group getting lost, fuel ran out, and the planes landed on the water. Only one made it back to base, 6 pilots were killed. In mid-1943, an updated version of the aircraft was released. The main improvement was a new glass canopy and a pilot's seat raised by a few inches, so visibility became better. To tame the tendency to drop a wing, a small plate was added on the right wing panel. Under the fuselage, the plane could carry 2 bombs or an additional fuel tank. From November 1943, some machines received a more powerful engine. A small series was produced with 4 cannons. In air battles, they were not very effective, but they worked well against ground targets and in night sorties. Next came a new modification. They returned to 6 heavy machine guns, and the main difference was 2 underwing mounts for bombs or additional tanks. In addition, the central mount allowed a heavy bomb to be hung. On later models, up to 8 rockets were mounted under the wings. This made the Corsair a very effective fighter bomber. To develop new tactics, at the end of 1943, the company enlisted the famous pilot Charles Lindbergh. He carried out 2 combat sorties with maximum load, 1 heavy bomb under the center and 2 under the wings, almost half the payload of a heavy bomber. During one sortie, Lindbergh destroyed Japanese anti-aircraft artillery positions, effectively proving that the new version could work as a powerful strike aircraft. In April 1944, carrier trials of the updated aircraft were completed. More than 100 takeoffs and landings were performed without a single accident. The improved landing gear was considered successful. On April 22nd, the Navy lifted all restrictions. The Corsair was now officially cleared for full carrier service. Mass carrier squadrons with Corsairs went to sea at the beginning of 1945, and the first confirmed success of the carrier-based aircraft in combat took place on January 3rd. During the battle for Okinawa, 10 carrier squadrons on Corsairs were active, and by the end of the campaign, almost all strike carriers carried such groups. On June 12, 1944, Germany began launching cruise missiles at England. The most effective method of countering them was to attack the launch sites from the air. In California, an especially powerful unguided rocket was created for the Navy, the Tiny Tim. 2 such rockets could be hung under a Corsair, turning it into a strike platform. In July, a special group was formed to strike missile positions in Europe. But production was delayed, and the ground forces quickly captured the launch areas, so the idea was abandoned. At the same time, the Night Corsair was being developed. Work had begun back in autumn 1941. The first Night prototype took to the air in autumn 1942. About 100 changes were made to the basic design. A radar was suspended on the right wing, a large screen was installed in the cockpit, and various equipment was added. 1 machine gun on the right was partly removed. Bomb mounts were provided for night strikes on ground targets. Night Corsairs had limited use simply because few were built. At first, they equipped a Navy night squadron in the Solomon Islands. On October 31, 1943, they carried out the first successful interception at night. Later, the Marine Corps also received night aircraft. After trials, they were transferred to the Marshall Islands, where on the night of April 13-14, the first successful radar-assisted combat took place. 2 enemy bombers were shot down. A few more victories remained unconfirmed. 1 plane was lost. The squadron also flew night missions with bombs against ground targets. Later, several night aircraft served on the carriers Essex, Hornet, and Intrepid. However, they did not become the Navy standard. Hellcats became the mass night fighters. At the same time, a daytime update was prepared, an improved model. The demand for a fresh version was so high that several thousand machines were ordered at once. Hundreds of changes were made to the design, but the main one was a more powerful engine with a 4-bladed propeller. Cruise speed rose to about 425 miles per hour, and with short-term boost to about 445 miles per hour. For better cooling, a lower air intake was added, visibility from the cockpit was improved, and access to radio equipment was made more convenient. The armament of 6 heavy machine guns was retained. About 200 pounds of armor were added. The plane could carry under the fuselage and wings 2 bombs of about 1,000 pounds each, or up to 8 rockets. This made it a very effective fighter bomber. A limited series was produced with 4 cannons for ground attack and night interception. There were also machines with automatic bombing equipment and a small reconnaissance version with a camera. By the end of the war, almost 2,000 of these aircraft had been built, and about 500 actually fought in the last campaigns over Okinawa, in raids on Tokyo, Saigon, and other important targets. After the war, orders were cut, production dropped to a few dozen per month, and by mid-1947, the number built had reached about 2,500. The Goodyear Company planned to produce this model under its own designation, but after the end of the war, the order for 500 aircraft was canceled. Back in spring 1944, the Navy had ordered a special version against kamikaze. In essence, it was a new aircraft. A powerful engine of about 3,000 horsepower was installed. The fuselage behind the cockpit was lowered, and a bubble canopy was added, so forward and rearward visibility became much better. Armament: 4 heavy machine guns with a large ammunition supply. Mounts: 2 bombs of about 1,600 pounds each, or 8 rockets. The land version had regular non-folding wings and no hook. The carrier version was equipped with everything needed for a carrier. Japan's surrender stopped the program. The order was canceled. The small batch built was bought by civilians and flown in races. At the same time, attempts were made to create a high-altitude Corsair with turbocharging. It held about 2,000 horsepower at nearly 40,000 feet and reached about 412 miles per hour at about 31,000 feet. But at low and medium altitudes, this version was inferior to the standard fighter, so they limited it to experimental machines. They did not enter Navy service. The wartime record of the Corsair is impressive. Although it began to be used widely only from 1944, it accounted for about 2,140 Japanese planes shot down for about 189 of its own lost in air combat. The kill-to-loss ratio was about 11-1. On average, more than 1 enemy aircraft was shot down for every 30 combat sorties. Japanese pilots often called the Corsair the best American fighter in the Pacific. At the same time, until the arrival of the late series, carrier landings were risky and non-combat losses were significant, including crashes during training flights and during carrier takeoffs or landings. After the war, an updated high-altitude aircraft appeared. It received a more modern engine with a 2-stage supercharger, a redesigned cowling, and better cockpit visibility. Maximum speed, about 462 miles per hour at about 400 feet. Service ceiling, about 100 feet. Instead of 6 machine guns, 4 cannons were installed. Under the fuselage, up to 2,000 pounds of bombs could be carried. Under the wings, up to 10 rockets. Production aircraft took to the skies in 1947. In total, about 568 machines of various sub-variants were built. There were night, all-weather, and reconnaissance modifications. The night versions had a lower maximum speed, about 435 miles per hour, ceiling, about 44,000 feet. Production continued into the early 1950s. In the summer of 1950, war broke out on the Korean Peninsula. By decision of the UN, a mixed force was created, with U.S. troops forming its core. At sea, more than 800 warships operated, among them 20 aircraft carriers, 16 American. Almost all American carriers carried Corsair fighters. In the first 10 months of the war, they flew the majority of naval aviation combat sorties. The Corsairs struck enemy reserves, airfields, and industrial facilities, and constantly supported their troops at the front. From December 4th to 7th, 1950 alone, about 900 sorties. It was they who covered carrier-based attack aircraft during the famous torpedo strike on the Hwasham Dam. In addition to ground strikes, night Corsairs intercepted and patrolled in the dark. Here, the aircraft's drawback once again made itself felt, its tendency to drop a wing at low speeds below approximately 170 kilometers per hour. These were exactly the speeds flown by the light North Korean night bombers. Yet American pilots adapted even to these conditions. The most famous among them, Lieutenant Guy Bordelon, in a short time in 1953 shot down 5 enemy planes. Corsairs even claimed jet fighters of the enemy, though their main work remained ground strikes. Altogether in Korea, Corsairs flew a significant share of the 255,000 combat sorties of naval aviation and the Marine Corps. Dozens of squadrons were based on 10 carriers and on land airfields in Korea and Japan. Losses were heavy. Several hundred Corsairs and attack aircraft, almost all to anti-aircraft fire. The last military version was a special Corsair for the French Navy, intended for operations in Southeast Asia. It was a combination of the attack version's airframe with the engine of a standard fighter, Fewer than 100 machines were built. They fought in Indochina in the spring of 1954, took part in the Suez Operation in 1956, flew over Algeria until the summer of 1962, and were still used in Tunisia in 1963. One squadron flew these Corsairs until October 1964. After the war, Corsairs also went to Latin America. El Salvador, Honduras, and Argentina bought them. In some places, they flew right up to the early 70s. When the first prototype took to the skies on May 29, 1940, few imagined that serial production would last 11 years. In total, more than 12,500 machines were built in over 20 variants. Corsairs were in service with the U.S. Navy from July 1942 to June 1957, an absolute record for piston fighters in the U.S. It was the last piston fighter produced in the United States. Its era ended with the arrival of jets, but the name did not vanish. By tradition, it was passed on to a jet attack aircraft. Under the Mutual Aid Program, the first Corsairs went to the British Fleet Air Arm as early 1943. The British received standard aircraft with their own designations and partially clipped the wings by about 35 centimeters, so they could fit into the lower hangars of their carriers. Pilots trained in the U.S. and along with the aircraft were ferried to Britain on escort carriers. The first squadrons went aboard, Illustrious, Vengeance, and Victorious. Unlike the Americans, the British used their Corsairs not only in the Pacific but also in Europe. On April 3, 1944, they covered torpedo bombers during a strike on the battleship Tirpitz in the fjords of northern Norway. The attack was unsuccessful, so further raids were carried out in the summer. At the same time, Corsairs of the British fleet began fighting in the Pacific. On April 19, 1944, they escorted torpedo bombers in a strike on the port of Sabang on Sumatra. And on January 24, 1945, during an attack on a large industrial facility, Corsairs shot down 13 Japanese fighters. From the spring of 1945, British Corsairs operated increasingly from carrier decks. From March 26 to April 4 alone, they flew 1/5 of the roughly 2,000 sorties of the Fleet Air Arm. In June-August, strikes were shifted directly to the Japanese islands. At the end of the war, 19 Corsair squadrons served in the British Fleet Air Arm. After Japan's capitulation, these units were quickly disbanded. The last two were reorganized on August 13, 1946. In total, under the supply program, Britain received just over 2,000 Corsairs in several variants. Deliveries to the Allies in the Pacific often went through escort carriers. The machines had to be carefully inspected and parts replaced due to sea corrosion. Later, aircraft began arriving disassembled in crates. On Espiritu Santo Island, assembly and repair facilities were set up, and a training squadron created for pilot conversion. The tempo quickly reached 2 Corsairs per day. The first 100 were ready by early June 1944. Part of the assembly was later moved to another island where they also assembled a variant from another manufacturer. The first to go into combat on Corsairs from the Royal New Zealand Air Force was No. 20 Squadron, on May 15, 1944 from Bougainville Island. By the end of the year, New Zealand Aviation already had 8 Corsair squadrons. The New Zealanders usually flew ground attack and light bombing missions against enemy ground targets and ships. In 1945, deliveries continued. Some machines arrived disassembled, wings, propellers, and equipment packed in separate crates. Others were assembled in New Zealand itself for training. In the end, New Zealand received more than 400 Corsairs, which served in 13 squadrons. After Japan's capitulation, the aircraft were returned home and personnel demobilized. Only one squadron remained in the occupation forces on the Japanese island of Honshu, first based at one airfield, then from February 1948 at another. When the decision was made to withdraw, it turned out that most machines were worn out. Transporting them back made no sense. In October 1948, they, along with spare parts and equipment, were centrally scrapped right at the airfield. At home in New Zealand, withdrawal from service also continued. By the late 40s, most Corsairs had been scrapped, and by the early 50s, this type of aircraft had disappeared from service. Thank you for watching. See you in new videos.